The smell of damp concrete, old carpet, and ozone from a hot television set still hits me whenever I think about Tommy's basement. It was 1985. I was 8 years old. Tommy's basement was the ultimate hangout spot. A dimly lit haven of beanbag chairs, an Atari 2600 hooked up to a sputtering Zenith TV, and walls wrapped in that cheap, dark 1970s faux wood paneling that every suburban house seemed to have back then. It was a great place to escape, except for one thing. Hanging right next to the door to the unfinished laundry room was a face. It was a severed, oversized head of a hobo, or maybe some deranged clown, made of hard, sickly-colored plastic. It had bulging, bloodshot eyes, a bulbous red nose, and a grotesque, wide-open mouth locked in a manic grin that showed too many teeth. Below the plastic chin hung a real garish fabric necktie. "Pull it," Tommy had said one afternoon, grinning mischievously. I reached out with a trembling hand and yanked the tie. Inside the plastic skull, a rusted spring groaned, followed by a mechanical wheezing sound that was supposed to be a laugh or a yodel, but sounded more like someone choking on their own spit. And then, without warning, a jet of cold, stale water shot directly from the plastic mouth and hit me right between the eyes. I screamed and scrambled backward over a beanbag. I didn't go back into Tommy's basement for 6 months. Decades passed. The Atari faded into history, but that face burned itself into my memory. A few years ago, I found myself wide awake at 3 a.m., unable to shake the image of that grotesque grin. I started digging online. A few frantic search queries finally gave it a name: the Laffun head, known originally in Europe as Lachköpfe. It was created in Austria in the 1970s by a man named Gustav Peter. Most vintage toy forums dismissed it as just another weird, slightly tasteless gag gift of the era, a relic of a time when toys were meaner. But the deeper I dug into translated German collector message boards and archive scans, the more unsettling the true story became. I found a digitized translation of an obscure interview from a 1981 Austrian hobbyist magazine, where an aging Gustav Peter finally explained where the face really came from. He claimed he wasn't trying to be funny. He was trying to exorcise a demon. According to the article, Gustav grew up in a remote alpine village outside of Graz in the late 1930s. His family lived down the lane from a local eccentric named Franz, a former carnival worker who had suffered severe facial nerve damage from a logging accident. The accident left Franz's face paralyzed in a wide, horrifying rictus grin. His eyes, however, always looked wide and panicked, contradicting the frozen smile. Franz had also lost his ability to speak properly. Instead, he communicated through high-pitched, guttural yelps and wheezing laughs. Local kids were terrified of him. In retaliation for their stares, Franz would hide behind the stone walls of his garden. When the children walked by, he would pop out with that terrifying, unblinking smile, unleash his wheezing laugh, and spit mouthfuls of water at them before retreating into the dark. Gustav wrote that he was severely traumatized by the spitting grin, having nightmares about the man well into his 40s. When Gustav became a novelty designer in the 1970s, he suffered a mild nervous breakdown related to the memories. A therapist suggested that to conquer his childhood phobia, he needed to take away its power. He needed to turn the monster into a joke. So Gustav sculpted the face. He exaggerated the eyes and painted on clown makeup to mask the reality of the man's injuries. He installed a small water pump and a crude sound chip that mimicked Franz's broken, wheezing laughter. He thought that if he could hang it on his wall and laugh at it, he would finally be free. The manufacturer loved the prototype, completely unaware of the dark inspiration behind it. They mass-produced it. They sold millions of them. Sitting in front of my glowing computer screen, reading that translation in the dead of night, my blood ran cold. I realized that back in 1985, standing in that wood-paneled basement, I wasn't just scared of a cheap plastic gag. Gustav Peter hadn't conquered his childhood trauma at all. He had just packaged it, mass-produced it, and shipped his nightmare into the homes of millions of unsuspecting kids like me. That realization alone should have been enough for me to close my laptop and finally go to sleep. But my obsession had taken root. I had to see the original article for myself. I spent weeks scouring international auction sites until I finally found a physical copy of that obscure 1981 Austrian hobbyist magazine. When it arrived, smelling of dust and old ink, I sat at my kitchen table with a German to English dictionary and painstakingly translated the interview line by line. That's when I realized the vintage toy forums had left out the final, buried paragraph of Gustav Peter's interview. Gustav had omitted a crucial detail about his childhood trauma. He hadn't just been an innocent bystander terrified of a deformed local eccentric. He was intimately connected to the logging accident that destroyed Franz's face. In the final column of the article, Gustav confessed that the accident hadn't been a random act of nature. He and his friends had been playing in the lumber yard where Franz worked, daring each other to climb the stacked, unsecured timber. Franz had seen them and rushed over, yelling for them to get down before the pile collapsed. They didn't listen. The logs shifted. Franz threw himself into the avalanche of wood to push young Gustav out of the way. The impact of the timber crushed Franz's jaw and severed his facial nerves. I sat back in my chair, the silence of my kitchen suddenly deafening. Franz hadn't been a monster hiding behind a garden wall to terrorize children. He was a hero who had given up his own face to save a child's life. The guttural yelps, the sudden appearances, the spitting water. He hadn't been trying to scare them for fun. Stripped of his ability to speak, he was likely trying to communicate, to warn them away from dangerous places, or perhaps in a tragic, broken way, just trying to play with the kids he had sacrificed everything for. And how had they repaid him? By throwing pebbles at his window and labeling him a monster. The Laffun head wasn't an exorcism of childhood fear. It was a monument to profound, inescapable guilt. Gustav didn't sculpt that face to take its power away. He sculpted it because he was deeply haunted by what he had done to a good man. By turning Franz into a mass-produced joke, complete with an exaggerated clown nose and a ridiculous tie, Gustav wasn't conquering a demon. He was unconsciously inviting the whole world to mock his savior, perhaps to make his own guilt easier to bear. I thought back to 1985, to Tommy's damp basement. I remembered pulling the tie, hearing that agonizing, wheezing sound, and feeling the cold water hit my face. As kids, we were terrified, but we also laughed. We pointed. We thought it was a gross, hilarious gag. Millions of us, all over the world, had spent the 1970s and 80s hanging a deformed hero on our walls, pulling his tie and laughing at his pain. The revelation left me hollow, but the obsession only deepened. Knowing the truth wasn't enough. I needed to hold the physical object again. I needed to look Franz in the eyes, armed with the truth. I went on eBay and tracked down a pristine inbox 1978 Laffun head, the hobo variant, exactly like the one in Tommy's basement. It cost me nearly $300. When the package arrived a week later, I placed the box on my workbench. As I pulled the plastic head from its styrofoam casing, the smell of off-gassing 1970s PVC plastic hit me. It was heavier than I remembered. There was the garish tie. There was the terrifying frozen grin. But looking at it now, knowing the man behind the mold, the face didn't look malicious. The widened eyes didn't look manic. They looked terrified. I decided to open it up. I unscrewed the backplate to examine the primitive water pump and the small, rusted audio cylinder. As I carefully pried the plastic casing apart, I noticed something strange about the internal design. The first twist lay in the tubing. The small, yellowed rubber hose that carried the water from the reservoir didn't naturally align with the mouth. In fact, the plastic molding inside the face had two distinct, unused channels leading directly up to the corners of the eyes. The hose had been forcefully bent, almost crimped, and glued down to redirect the water to the hole in the mouth. I dug back into the digital archives, looking up the original 1974 patent filed by Gustav Peter. The patent diagrams confirmed my suspicion. Gustav had never designed the Laffun head to spit. He had designed it to cry. The toy was meant to weep tears from its bulging eyes when the tie was pulled. Gustav was trying to create a physical manifestation of his own sorrow, a weeping monument to the man whose life he had ruined. But when he pitched the prototype to the toy executives in Vienna, they balked. A crying, disfigured man wasn't fun. It was depressing. According to a scribbled margin note on a manufacturer's spec sheet I found, an executive had demanded, "Make it do something funny. Make it spit." And just like that, corporate greed twisted a tragic apology into a grotesque, gross-out gag. But if the spitting was a corporate mandate, what about the sound? The second twist was hidden in the audio. I carefully removed the crude mechanical sound box, a tiny battery-powered phonograph cylinder that triggered when the tie was pulled. It was the source of that horrible, wheezing, choking laugh that had haunted my childhood. I'm an audio engineer by trade, so I took the fragile cylinder to my studio. I built a custom rig to play the tiny grooves and recorded the audio directly into my software. The file was a mess of static, clicks, and a high-pitched mechanical scratching that sounded like manic laughter, but it was on a cheap 1970s toy cylinder. The playback speed was artificially sped up to sound cartoonish. My hands shook as I applied a pitch correction algorithm, and slowed the playback down by 40%. I ran it through a noise reduction filter to strip away the hiss of the old plastic. I hit play. It wasn't a wheezing laugh. It wasn't a gag. It was a human voice. It was distorted, painful, and labored. The sound of a man with a shattered jaw struggling to form words. The recording wasn't an actor. Gustav had somehow obtained or made a real recording of Franz. Through the studio monitors, the laugh stretched out into 3 distinct, agonizingly slow German syllables. Hab keine Angst. Don't be afraid. I sat in the glow of my monitors, tears finally spilling over my own cheeks. Franz hadn't been laughing at the kids who threw rocks at him. When he popped out from behind the wall, wheezing and yelping, he had been desperately trying to tell the terrified children not to fear him. Gustav had taken Franz's ultimate plea for acceptance, sped it up to sound like the cackling of a madman, and sold it. Millions of times over, kids like me had pulled that tie, and Franz had begged us not to be afraid of him, only for us to scream and run away. I turned back to the plastic head sitting on my workbench. The frozen, terrified eyes stared blankly back at me. I carefully reached out, took the garish fabric tie in my hand, and gently pulled it,